A question I'd have for Pudge Hoffman this morning is, after the British get word of this disastrous defeat of the Hessians at Trenton and the defeat of the British at Princeton and New Brunswick, how do they react to that, Pudge?
Doesn't Cornwallis send reinforcements?
Yeah, but he did. I mean, but we still win these battles. We're past that. So when they see that we've defeated their forces at Princeton, New Brunswick, and before that Trenton, what's their reaction? Are they
get out of Jersey?
Well, they do, but what do you think their reaction is? Are they going to back off and you know, kowtow to these Americans, or are they going to get irritated and get after them?
Yeah.
They're going to get irritated and get after them. So the point to be made is that the British defeats at Trenton and Princeton and New Brunswick gave them more determination to end the war. And the British made the statement that because of these American victories, they were going to press even harder, and their goal was to defeat the Americans by the end of 1777. They wanted this war over by the end of 1777. And they come up with this plan, and I want you to look at the map up here. Their goal at this point, they being the British, is they want to separate these New England states from the rest of the colonies, because they believe most of the power of the colonists is in the north. And so they're going to try to completely split New England away from the rest of the colonies and make New England kind of an island of their own, defeating the north and then eventually moving south. What are they going to have in the south that would be to their advantage a little bit? A lot more what live in the south than the north?
Loyalists.
Loyalists. Because there's a lot of people in the south that aren't that excited about a war with Great Britain because they're making great money. They're plantation owners and wealthy merchants and those type of things that live on the eastern seaboard of the south. So the goal of the British at this point is, let's separate the bad guys, New Englanders, from the rest of the south and see if we can't win this war by the end of 1777. So on April 13th, of 1777, the British will assault a town called Danbury, which is in Connecticut. So on April 13th of 1777, the British set their sights on a small town in Connecticut called Danbury. And the reason why they are attacking Danbury is because the Patriots have stockpiled supplies and ammunition there, according to what information the British has received, and they're going to Danbury to secure that equipment and ammunition that they have stockpiled. So, on April 13th of 1777, the British assault a town called Danbury, Connecticut, and they're looking to seize colonial army ammunition and supplies that they have heard rumor are there. So they get into town, they don't find much ammunition and supplies, frustrates them, so what do?
Leave.
No, before they leave, they do what? They're going to destroy it. Very good. They started a fire. Okay? They started a fire. Well, if you're the citizens of Danbury, you need some help, and you're not going to get help from the Continental Army. They're not even close to there. So who are you going to depend on to come to your rescue? Militia. Very good, Connor. Unfortunately, the closest militia is not Connecticut. It's in Fredericksburg, New York. So what happens is a messenger is sent from Danbury to Fredericksburg, New York, to get a hold of the man that leads that militia and ask him to round up his men and get to Danbury to help save the town. Okay? So, again, the people of Danbury are looking for help. The only help they're going to get is from local militia. Unfortunately, the closest militia is in Fredericksburg, New York. So the people of Danbury send a messenger as fast as he can ride to get to Fredericksburg to get a hold of a fellow by the name of Henry Ludington. Henry Ludington. And Henry Ludington is the head of this militia in Fredericksburg, New York. And they're going to get a hold of him and tell him what's going on. And then he's going to have to go out and send word to where? All over Fredericksburg, to round up his militiamen who are probably at home in bed, right? So, Danbury's under siege. They send a messenger to Fredericksburg, New York, to get a note to Henry Ludington that he needs to round up his militia and bring them to Danbury to save the town. Well, the messenger gets there and he's incredibly tired and exhausted. And he informs Henry Luddington about the issue. But what's Luddington need him to do? Even though he's exhausted and can't go, he needs him to do what? He needs him to continue on and stop at all of these farmhouses or whatever, arise these militiamen and get them back to Luddington's home so he can take them to Danbury. Well, this guy is just absolutely shot. And in order to round up those 400 to 500 militiamen, Henry Luddington's going to need someone else to go around and round up these militiamen. So he's sitting there alone without his men. He needs to get the word out to as many of the militiamen as possible, and he needs the men who are spread out all across the countryside with their families to report to his farm as soon as possible. So he strongly encourages this messenger to continue his ride and notify his men, but the man is exhausted and cannot continue. Okay, why can't he make the ride himself? Think about it. He's got to get him back to his farm. He's got to get him organized. He can't be in two places at one time. He can't go round them up and then bring them all back. I guess he could, and then get them organized. What would be faster? If he prepared them as they came in, he needs somebody to go do that. Well, this is kind of an interesting story. At this point, when he's panicking on who he's going to get to make this ride, his 16-year-old daughter, Sybil Luddington, turns to her father and volunteers to be the messenger he desperately needs. Who did the report on Sybil Luddington? Yes?
Is it S or C? There's a hole right in the middle.
Yeah.
Oh, it's F. Oh, is it? Yeah. Yes. Sybil is S-Y-B-I-L. Is this making sense?
I'm not ready.
Okay, well, good. It's making sense, okay? So at this point, 16-year-old daughter Sybil turns to her father and volunteers to be the messenger he desperately needs. She's a strong-willed girl. She's a very experienced rider, and the most important thing is she absolutely knows the location of all these farmhouses, whereas this other messenger would have been more guessing than he would have been for sure. But she's a 16-year-old girl, and nothing against girls, but at that time, that wasn't what a 16-year-old girl did. I mean, that just was kind of unusual. Matter of fact, it was pretty astonishing. So Sybil is a very strong-willed girl. She's an experienced rider. She knows the location of the homes of the men her father needs. And she rides all night long, covering 40 miles alone. And goes to each of these farmers' homes and has them report to her father's home so he can get them organized. So Sybil Luddington, 16-year-old girl, rides all night. She covers 40 miles alone and informs her father's men to report to the farm. Now, we are so excited about Paul Revere, and everybody hears about Paul Revere and his midnight ride. She rode 24 miles more than Revere did on his famous night, and she made it alone. He had people with him. Now, you think about that. She's, to me, way more famous than Paul. And Paul Revere failed. He got caught, right? And who had to make the final run for him? Samuel Prescott, right? So when you think about Paul Revere and what made Paul Revere? Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, just before the Civil War. This gal had way more on the ball than he did. Well, the next morning, Luddington had rounded up 470 militiamen, and they were joined by 2,000 American soldiers who were able to get there at Richfield, Connecticut. So the next morning, Luddington's 470 militia are joined by 2,000 American soldiers at Richfield, Connecticut. Now, during this Battle of Richfield, the Americans attacked the British and saved the ammunition and supplies. They also fight a nearby battle in the same area at Bound Brook So when you talk about the Battle of Richfield and Bombrook, it's all in the area of what? Danbury, Connecticut. Okay? Now, the thing that this accomplished, this American victory, is that the British never again invaded Connecticut the rest of the war. And it slowed down their strategy to do what?
Attack.
Separate
The
New England from the rest of the colonies. It's a very important battle, and it doesn't happen. Do we win this battle without another unsung hero? Sybil Ludington. If she doesn't make this 40-mile ride alone and round up that militia, this whole thing doesn't happen. So there's another example of someone that has helped the cause.
Wait, I thought you said they started a fire in the town.
They did.
Then how did the Americans save the town?
Well, because how the Americans say they didn't burn the town to the ground. Is that what you mean? They started a fire. They sent somebody and said, if you don't get here, we're going to have issues here. So they come back and save Danbury. They have a battle at Bombrook and Richfield, and they secure the entire colony of Connecticut, based on Sybil Ludington's run. Okay? All right. That'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is colonial sharpshooters enter the Revolutionary War. Colonial sharpshooters. What do we call them in today's military? Snipers. Yeah, snipers. Colonial sharpshooters enter the Revolutionary War. Now, by the fall of 1777, approximately 500 American riflemen were being trained to help the American cause in the Revolutionary War as sharpshooters or snipers. So they took about 5 members of either militia or the Continental Army and were training them to become sharpshooters to help the cause of the Revolutionary War. Now, these sharpshooters or snipers are going to become a huge asset to the Continental Army. And they have a special rifle called a Kentucky long rifle that allows them to have remarkable accuracy and provide tremendous support to the Continental Army. So, the sharpshooters were a huge asset to the Continental Army because of their remarkable accuracy using what we know as a Kentucky long rifle. Now, what other rifles were they using at the time? What did they call them?
muskets.
Muskets. Okay, muskets. And there's a huge difference. So these rifles, these Kentucky long rifles, served a completely different purpose than the muskets that were being used by soldiers in the Continental Army. And I'll tell you the difference between the two. Okay? Now, a musket has a smooth barrel. And the ball that they shot, a mini ball, was smaller than the barrel. So when a musket is fired, as that mini ball goes down the barrel, what does it do? Bounces around. So it's going to be inaccurate, right? It's going to be inaccurate. Now, what were these? If you look at military in those days, how did we had rules, and they marched in formation right at each other, right? And one commander would say, "Back ready, aim, fire," and they'd fire, and a bunch of people would fall down the other side, then the other ones would fire. It was just kind of how they did things, and you'll see some samples of this in videos. So these muskets were used for volley fire, which means you really weren't aiming at anything, right? In other words, you were firing into a group. So if that ball bounced up and down that barrel and went out inaccurately, it's going to hit something when you're shooting into a large group. So that was what a musket was used for. It was used by infantry to fight each other in organized lines. So a musket had a smooth barrel with a ball smaller than the barrel, which meant the bullet traveled erratically until it left the weapon. And a musket's used to shoot into a group as a volley with the idea that the bullet would hit something, not necessarily anything you aim directly at. Now, a Kentucky long rifle had a really long barrel, and inside the barrel were grooves, making the bullet spin. And as it spins down the barrel, it's going to come out, and it's going to be much more accurate. Okay? And that's why a Kentucky long rifle was used for sniping. So a Kentucky long rifle has a long barrel with grooves inside the barrel. The bullet spins and gives it a very accurate shot. Now, a skilled sniper during these days could hit a specific enemy soldier anywhere from 100 to 300 yards. And they did not have scopes on these, okay? So these guys were good. And they could hit a target, a pretty small target, anywhere from 100 to 300 yards. Who was the most skilled sniper of all in the Revolutionary War?
Timothy Murphy.
Timothy Murphy. Who did reports on that, though? You did, didn't you? 26-year-old fella, Timothy Murphy. He was a Pennsylvania backwoodsman, which means what?
Growing up shooting.
Yeah, he grew up shooting. Grew up on probably farms, hunted a lot. But the most successful of all of these Continental Army snipers was 26-year-old Pennsylvania backwoodsman by the name of Timothy Murphy. Now, we told you about a rule of war is you didn't fight in the winter, right? Did you pick this up? What's another rule of war that Timothy Murphy broke?
Well, I know he made like a 600-yard shot when he shot Frazier.
So Simon Frazier, but what was Simon
He
Frazier?
was general when he was on his horse.
Okay, so what was the unwritten rule at the time?
Aren't you not supposed to shoot?
You didn't shoot officers. Because if the philosophy was if you went ahead and picked off officers, you would have undisciplined troops and no organization. You'd have disarray in battle. So another rule of war was that you did not shoot officers out of a battle. You didn't target them and shoot them as snipers. These officers were required through their military training to lead their men into battle, often putting the officers in the most vulnerable positions up front. Okay? And the idea was we're going to avoid leaderless armies at war and the disarray it would cause for both sides in battle. So if you shot an officer in battle, that was a war crime. It was an ungentlemanly act. Something you didn't do. Okay? That was the rule of war. Didn't shoot officers. That would leave armies leaderless and disarray. Nobody could possibly take over and lead. Well, the Americans are trying to win their independence. They've already broke the rule of war of what? Fighting when? In the winter. So, despite the rule, the Americans' most valued targets during the war are going to be British officers. Now, you can't beat them, join them. So what do the British do? They start training, well they start first of all training soldiers in their army to become sharpshooters or snipers as well. But the British has a little bit tougher time shooting our officers than we had shooting their officers. And Kendrick makes a good point. We're going to get to an incredibly important battle later in the war in which Timothy Murphy is going to take out a general by the name of Simon Frazier, which is going to leave the British Army in disarray, and it's going to lead to a victory, a big victory for the Americans in the Revolution. But that's what this is all about, okay? So, when you talk about sharpshooters, the Americans started training them first, about 500. They went from the musket to the Kentucky long rifle for the reasons I gave, and they trained these men to shoot officers as well. Anybody watch the movie The Patriot? Okay? Do you remember the scene in The Patriot when Cornwallis was upset because they were shooting their officers? Remember he said he kept them hostage and he really didn't have any officers. He just put straw in these uniforms and had them in a distance. If you guys got to watch The Patriot. If I can find the non-R-rated version, if I can get that, we'll watch it. It's a great movie about the colonial militia during the American Revolution. Well, anyway, with this sharpshooter thing in mind, let's go to our next subtopic, which is a blown opportunity for the British. A blown opportunity for the British to end the Revolutionary War. And it has to do with sharpshooters. Who wrote the report on Patrick Ferguson? Anybody here have Patrick Ferguson? Probably maybe somebody that's gone. Okay. Well, who is known as the Americans' best sharpshooter? Timothy Murphy. The man that was known as the British best sharpshooter was Captain Patrick Ferguson. Captain Patrick Ferguson was known as the British. Did you have him?
Yeah, you did.
You know what happened here, don't you? Now, Captain Ferguson was actually Scottish, and he was an officer in the British Army, and he's going to have a golden opportunity to end the Revolutionary War. So the most skilled sharpshooter for the British is Captain Patrick Ferguson, He's a Scottish officer in the British Army, and he's going to have a golden opportunity to end the Revolutionary War. It happens like this. In September of 1777, colonial forces are battling British forces in Pennsylvania at the Battle of Brandywine. Okay? In September of 1777, colonial forces are engaging British forces in Pennsylvania at a battle called the Battle of Brandywine. Now, it's not uncommon to have scouts ahead of your main army to see where the enemy is so you can attack. And it just so happened that Captain Ferguson and his men were scouting ahead of the British main army who were on the march to see where the enemy is. And as Captain Ferguson and these men are on this routine reconnaissance mission, and reconnaissance is when you go out and see where the enemy is, he suddenly spots an American general through the trees. So picture this. Patrick Ferguson's got some other soldiers with him. They're on a reconnaissance or scouting mission. They're ahead of the British Army, scouting the position of the Americans so they can engage them successfully. And as Captain Ferguson is on this routine reconnaissance mission, he suddenly spots an American general through the trees. Guess who this general was? Who was it, Pudge?
Washington.
George Washington. George Washington. Well, Ferguson puts Washington dead in his sights and gets ready to possibly end the Revolutionary War. How do the Americans do if Washington is done? Probably it's over. And he's got Washington in his sights as Washington is sitting on his horse, and all of a sudden Washington turns and his back